What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 43, and I'm the host, Kyle Lanslone. On today's show, I'm joined by Dave DeCamp of antiwar.com. He's the assistant news editor and writes several news stories there every day, several days a week. So, news.antiwar.com, and that's where you could keep up on the U.S. empire. Dave, of course, is the first repeat guest of the show, and I'll link to his previous episode in the show notes page and on the YouTube channel. So either go to the Libertarian Institute or Conflicts of Interest on YouTube, and subscribe to the show, subscribe on your podcast feed, like, share, do everything that you can to help the show get out there to more people. And the other thing you could do is support the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde. Not only will you be supporting the show when you buy products from Paloma Verde, but you're going to be supporting a great small business. Carlos and his wife Vanessa were putting together this great company, and COVID struck. The lockdowns really killed the physical storefront, but they didn't let it kill their business, and adopted it into more of an online presence. And Carlos wants to support and work with people who believe in the same principles that he does. And so he's partnered with Conflicts of Interest and other podcasts to, get the word out about his great CBD products. One of the reasons that I really like Paloma Verde CBD is because they have lab tested results on their products, and you know what you're getting when you buy those. So if it says it's an extract with this percentage of CBD, that's exactly what it is. No more gummy worms from the gas station. So, check out those products. If we use the promo pro piece at checkout, it's going to help you out, and it's going to let Carlos know that you're hearing about, his products from the show, and it helps the show out. So do that, and let's get into the interview. All right, Dave, welcome back to the show. How you doing?
Good, Kyle. Thanks for having me back. Happy to be here.
Yeah, you're the first repeat guest of the show, so I could say everybody check out the show notes page, and you'll find Dave's previous appearance on Conflicts of Interest there. Man, you've been writing a lot, and so we got a lot to cover. I want to just jump right into it.
Yeah.
This is some really important stuff here, and this one's titled "NDAA seeks to halt troop withdrawals from Afghanistan and Germany." Time and time again, I hear people say, "Oh, Congress needs to get more involved in foreign policy. Look at the Constitution." And I'm like, it might not be that good of an idea. And this is the reason why. And so, talk a little bit about how Congress plans to keep U.S. troops in more foreign places.
Yeah. So this is a pretty horrible amendment. It's two amendments that were added to the National Defense Authorization Act, the annual military spending bill, and this is the what they call a compromise version. So the House puts forward their version, the Senate, and then in conference they compromise and they form the final NDAA, and then the president signs it and it becomes law. And I believe both of these amendments came from the House. I remember it was around the time that the Russian bounty hoax story broke over the summer, and Liz Cheney and some Democrats got together and added an amendment to the NDAA to block the Afghanistan withdrawal. So the way it works, currently, the Trump administration is drawing down. Their plan is to bring the numbers down to 2,500 by January 15th. And so they started the process, and this says whenever the NDAA becomes law that they need a report from the Pentagon, from the State Department, from the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, to assess if it's safe to pull the troops out for U.S. security interests. So it's essentially a roadblock to a complete Afghanistan withdrawal, which is what the U.S. Taliban peace deal paved the way for a full withdrawal by spring 2021. So when the NDAA becomes law, it'll go into effect then. So say there's 3,000 troops and Trump's trying to bring the additional 500 home or whatever, then it'll block it until this report happens, I guess. And then it says that it'll happen again to bring numbers below 2,000. So it's just a bad sign. And then we know Biden has said he can't promise a full Afghanistan withdrawal. Fortunately, it's something that he didn't have to talk about much on the campaign trail, but the few times he did, he said a small like counterterrorism force. So so it's pretty bleak, a full Afghanistan withdrawal. And then Germany, this is sad because it's like the littlest things that they could give us, like we just can't even get. So the Trump administration has a plan to bring about 12,000 U.S. troops out of Germany. There's approximately 36,000 there now. Would bring it down to 24,000. Still be one of the biggest U.S. troop presences in Europe. But Congress, of course, is against it. They say it's a gift to Russia. Before he was fired, Mark Esper, Trump's former Secretary of Defense, he was selling it as we're repositioning about half of them closer to Russia's border. And then it looked like they were going to actually put most of the troops from Germany into like Poland and Lithuania and Latvia and stuff. But so that's how he was trying to spin it. But I mean, I don't even think this is necessary because I don't think Biden's gonna. I think he's gonna, he's not. He's gonna reverse that plan. That's pretty much guaranteed. I think that Biden would not bring those troops home. So, yeah, just two really, really bad amendments. And yeah, this is usually what happens. We hear about some good stuff that is added to the NDAA, like Tulsi Gabbard had something that would require a report on sanctions, on the impact that they have on the civilian populations of countries. That got gutted. All the good stuff usually gets gutted. One thing that was gutted was Tom Cotton tried to allocate about $10 million to restart live nuclear tests. And then that was the Senate version. And the House had kind of a competing thing that I forget how they did it or how they worded it, but it would have kind of blocked that. And then, so they just scrapped both of those. So at least live nuke tests aren't on the agenda for the next year, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's, kind of, I guess, crazy that this is the way Congress decides to act. I guess it would be different if they had like constantly tried to micromanage and, oh, you got to bring 2,000 troops out of Iraq but then you can't take them out of Afghanistan. But it always seems to go this particular way where, they only act. And this is the only time it seems to carry force, too, because sometimes Congress will say, Trump can't wage the war in Yemen, or they will, in the past, they've required reports that were supposed to, say, I think, report on like Saudi human rights abuses or something in order for Saudis to get our weapons. And they just never gave the reports. And so it seems like the only time it carries weight is when it's going in this particular direction of more war.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and speaking of Yemen, there was a bill introduced into the House that calls for an end to that war, which is good. It was a bipartisan bill introduced by Rep. DeFazio. I think his first name's Peter. But it was co-sponsored by a few Republicans, Matt Gaetz, Ted Yoho, Ro Khanna, and it's kind of a similar resolution that Trump vetoed. It calls, because the critics of the first war powers resolution that called for an end for the war in Yemen, they say, oh, we don't have any troops there, it's not necessary. But if you look at the definition of the 1973 War Powers Act, it also says any troops engaged, like supporting hostilities in foreign countries, and they kind of, the way that it's framed, it's that how the U.S. is supporting Saudi Arabia, which at this point we're still training their pilots and stuff, and probably sharing intelligence more than we would ever really know, and logistical support and stuff like that. Even just selling them all those weapons. So that's one good thing that's happened in Congress. So hopefully that gets some momentum.
Right. The other thing I have here on the NDAA that you had written up is just, the public controversy surrounding the bill and the debate. You really don't see anything about Congress is trying to block Trump's truth movements and stuff like it. May be a headline here or there, but not really. Most of
Yeah.
the debate that I'm seeing talked about is actually around the repeal of Section 230 and whether Trump is going to have to, or Congress, they'll have to rename bases that were named after
Yeah, yeah.
Confederate generals.
Yeah,
And,
because
and
that'll fix
so,
everything.
yeah, you had written that, but I just thought that's interesting that that's where the debate lies. And so, do you think Trump is going to end up vetoing this? And I, I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, that would be cool. Like, I don't know what he's gonna actually. I don't know if he would do it. I think he still might be too much of kind of a military guy, troops guy to do it. Um, but the other issue that the issues that he really has with it, I haven't seen. Have you seen if he said anything or any of his people have said anything about the amendments to block the troop withdrawals?
Not that I've seen. The only thing I saw that him gave an actual statement on was the Confederate the generals and
Oh,
bases.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he wants them to include a provision that would repeal Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act. And this is what gives tech platforms like social media companies, Twitter, Facebook, and stuff. It gives them immunity from liability for third-party posts on their websites, for third-party publishers is how it's worded. So if you write a tweet, if you write a Facebook post, they're not liable for it. And Trump wants to repeal that, after all of the censorship that's been happening with a clear liberal bias, especially since the Hunter Biden email thing. That was kind of the most in your face when there was a New York Post story about an email that had something to do with his Ukraine business dealings, and the Twitter, you couldn't even click on the link. I mean, but that's part of, I mean, I don't know how I feel. I don't know enough about this stuff. I don't know how I feel about the Section 230. To me, it seems like that would it would kind of benefit these big tech companies, because then it would probably make it harder for any smaller social media outlet or up and coming tech company to really break into. It's kind of like um, if you can't make a social media platform and people can't just write whatever they want, then you're not gonna really go anywhere. So yeah,
Right.
but I don't know. I mean, I really I don't know enough about this stuff to really comment on that. But yeah, but that's what Trump wants. I get it. I get why he and his base is very upset with the social media companies. And something I pointed out in the article is that it's not just they don't just censor, Trump Republican right wing stuff. Another thing that they do target, specifically Facebook, is they target things that go against kind of the mainstream foreign policy, like NATO narrative. And part of the reason why is because um, Facebook, they teamed up with the Atlantic Council, which is funded by NATO, by the UAE, by defense companies, by the U.S. State Department. And one of the worst examples of it was after they assassinated Soleimani, the Iranian general. They were taking down posts of people who said like favorable things about him. If you were like, oh, he defeated ISIS, he was the great, or whatever, however, somebody worded it, they would take it down or flag it or whatever. And they've also taken down South Front is one website that they just
Mm-hmm.
erased. They're an independent news outlet. They've been accused uh, of being like run by Russian intelligence with no proof. They put out these just like reports that just they don't mean anything. There's no evidence. There's no investigation or anything. It's just these think tanks and all this corporate and military contractor money, and some far left. Maybe that's not the best way to um, label them, but I don't know if you know. It's going down. They're like a left wing anarchist website. They were taken off of Facebook. So yeah, it's a real big problem. It's really anybody that goes against the mainstream can be a target, especially now after Russiagate. Just really after blaming the 2016 election on Facebook posts, they just really stepped up the censorship. So it's a big problem. I don't know if this would really make things better, or it might just make things worse. Part of me thinks they want to be more regulated, the social media companies.
Yeah, well, they definitely seem to want to have more ties to the government and to be in on that pipeline. I think they're more than willing to turn our data into dollars, especially when that data is going to the government. So, that's one of my concerns. I've heard people make arguments on this Section 230 thing around like it would even apply to like websites with comment sections, and like everything in the comment section would then have to be regulated for like, I guess, slander possibility or something like that, or the website curator would be responsible. So, why this whole thing sounds like a huge mess of government regulating things. And I guess the part about it that I find most interesting is this is the National Defense Authorization Act. I mean, this is supposed to be where Congress could like restrain the president on foreign policy, and yet it's ends up being debates about base names, and which maybe there's an important reason to change the names of these bases or keep them the same, but it seems like that's a pretty separate debate than how many troops need to be in Afghanistan, and one seems to be a hell of a lot more important. Should we be bombing Iraq or not, versus
Mm.
what's the name of the base where the planes fly from to kill the babies, right? Like,
Yeah.
um, there's a couple more things going on in Congress that I want to bring up with you. You have this article here. All these articles are at news.antiwar.com. This one titled Senate to Vote on Blocking $23 billion UAE Arms Sale Next Week. And so, hell, this time maybe Congress is going to do the right thing. Tell us about the details here.
Yeah. So the Trump administration, one of their last moves was they're trying to push through this really big arms sale to the UAE. At $23 billion, it's F-35 fighter jets, Reaper drones, missiles, and munitions. And it's their reward for normalizing with Israel. And Pompeo has made it pretty clear lately that this, what they call the Abraham's Accords, were about isolating Iran, is how he put it, kind of building up an anti-Iran coalition. So right now you have the UAE and Bahrain agreed to normalize. Sudan did, but I think they're having some trouble. I'm not sure the details, but a lot of people inside Sudan are not thrilled about it. So some senators got together and they introduced some resolutions to block these arms sales to the UAE, because there's a lot of good reasons to not sell them weapons, including their involvement in Yemen. They've been involved in Libya, and but anyway, I'll start with the good part. This is Bob Menendez, Chris Murphy, and Rand Paul. They got together to introduce these resolutions, and a big part of it, trying to block arms sales to the UAE, is the war in Yemen. Now, the UAE, they claim that they haven't been militarily involved in Yemen in about a year, and there was a split from them and the Saudi-led coalition. The Saudis are the biggest, criminals in that war, but the UAE was right there with them for most of it, and they split over. The UAE supports a southern separatist group, and they fought the Hadi government, the U.S. Saudi-backed Hadi government. But the UAE has also, as we know, there's some reports about it. There's a 2019 report from CNN that demonstrates a lot of weapons sold to Saudi Arabia and the UAE end up in the hands of Al-Qaeda in Yemen, or Al-Qaeda-linked militants. And it seems to be more so the UAE that's kind of backing these Al-Qaeda guys in Yemen. There's also a report from the AP in 2018 that said they interviewed some Al-Qaeda-linked folks that were on the U.S. terror list that were being paid by the UAE to fight the Houthis and stuff. And another detail, just because everything's absurd, the Houthis, the people that the Trump administration is considering designating as a terrorist group, they were the Washington's partner in its fight against Al-Qaeda in Yemen as early as January. Not as early as, but in January 2015, there's reports that show that the U.S. was sharing intelligence with the Houthis, and then in March 2015, just a few months later, the Saudis intervened to fight the Houthis, and the U.S., the Obama administration, backed them. So, Yeah, so there's a lot of good reasons not to sell weapons to the UAE. And then there's another reason that Menendez seems more concerned about. To his credit, he has been good on Yemen, from what I understand, and selling to the Saudis. But there's this thing called the qualitative military edge, and it's insane, really, reading about this stuff, because it's mandated by U.S. law that Congress should ensure that Israel has military superiority over its neighbors. It's called the qualitative military edge. The QME is the abbreviation for it. And so a lot of these congressmen and senators and stuff, they're concerned that this sale will Israel lose its edge over its neighbors, because they have all this great military equipment that we give them and sell them and stuff. But Israel's kind of signed off on this deal because we agreed to give them a bunch of their own weapons. So they're happy to let it go through. But some bills were introduced, a few bills were introduced that I don't think they really went very far after because the first thing rumored was the F-35 fighter jet sale to the UAE. We were hearing about that for a long time. So once those rumors started, the bills to block the sale, not to block the sale, but to ensure the QME was upheld, started coming in. And one of them would require the president to consult Israel before making sales to the Middle East, like essentially giving Israel the power to veto these weapon sales, which is pretty crazy.
Right. Well, I mean, I remember talking about, I think it was Kelly Vallejos who wrote that the Abraham Accords, which were portrayed as a peace deal, actually seem to have ignited an arms race in the Middle East between two U.S. allies, where the UAE and Israel are trying to get more weapons because of this. I'm sure Bahrain will get some too, and once Sudan will be on the terror list, that will, among other things, open them up to receive some weapons, and I'm sure military aid from the U.S. as long as they're abiding by the line and stuff. Now, you have this other story here, and it says the envoy to the UAE would reluctantly find weapons elsewhere if the U.S. doesn't supply them. And this is one of the things the U.S. Hawks will say is they'll say, Dave, well, we understand that some bad things happen with these weapons, but they're just going to buy them from China, and then they could do worse things with those weapons. And this is the UAE saying, well, we'll buy them somewhere else. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, this was the UAE foreign minister. He said we would reluctantly get them elsewhere. I mean, my opinion on it is okay. Go ahead. But I mean, he says, the U.S. has all the most advanced equipment, so we have such a big industry dedicated to pumping out these crazy weapons. But yeah, I mean, I think it would be better for the U.S. to not be involved with the UAE this way, and if China wants to step in and into that role, then let them. But I don't think that they wouldn't give them the full-throated support that the U.S. gives them in these horrible wars. So I more so Saudi Arabia, I think, is the real just when I use the word full-throated, Saudi Arabia comes to mind. How much the Trump administration has just completely let them do whatever they want, wage this war in Yemen with our weapons, and just not even like bat an eye. I mean, Congress has, but because Trump likes to see these weapon sales, I don't know. I just don't think the U.S. should be involved in this stuff at all. So,
right. Well, and as he says in here, they want the U.S. weapons, and I'm sure there's more compatibility issues than he makes it out to be. If they have a bunch of U.S. weapons, the Chinese parts don't always work exactly the same way and stuff like that. And there's also like a lot of long-term contracts for maintenance on these weapons and planes and stuff like that I'm sure if we pull the rug out from under them, maybe they could buy Chinese fighter planes, but that's going to be a hell of a lot more expensive.
yeah.
So I'm sure be an extremely expensive move to start adopting, Chinese weapon systems. Although I do know they fly Chinese drones because I think they've been using them in Libya. But let's talk about China a little bit because I saw a um, couple headlines here that I thought were interesting. One was that I guess NATO had identified Beijing as like a potential threat, and then Beijing had offered dialogue in response. So, talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, so NATO released a new report that calls for them to kind of focus more on China. I mean, it identifies Russia. They still say that Russia is NATO's top threat, but it has all these strategies for kind of countering Chinese influence, and one of them is kind of engaging more and building partnerships with countries in the region, like Australia and New Zealand and Japan and South Korea, and India too, which is interesting because the U.S. I mean, NATO kind of follows the U.S. and the U.S. has clearly been prioritizing China, kind of on both sides of the aisle. I mean, Biden said in a recent interview that Russia was the top military threat, but I think he's all China, all eyes on China for him and his incoming administration. And so one thing that the Trump administration has been doing, besides increasing the military footprint in the region, sending all these warships and planes over there, is they've been trying to build up these stronger alliances. And there's this kind of informal alliance. It's the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia. They're known as the Quad. And Pompeo and other U.S. officials have said that this Quad could be the basis of like an Asian NATO, kind of like a big security military alliance to counter Chinese influence. And the U.S. recently signed a defense pact with India, a new one. It'll like share satellite data with them. This is right after, the tensions are high between India and China. They just had that border skirmish. The Quad countries, the four of them, they just held these massive military exercises together, Australia, Japan, the US, and India, for the first time in over a decade, which it's saying something because it was this annual drill that the US and India have done for like 20 years. And India was always wary to include Australia because they didn't want to send the wrong message to China, but this year they did. And so, everything's moving in this direction of China. And of course, NATO is going to want to get in on that, and because they just want to grow and they need a reason to be around. Because when people really understand how little of a threat, I feel like more people are kind of understanding how little of a threat Russia is, and China is big bad and communist and scary. So yeah, there's a lot of money to be made in surrounding China and forging these new kind of alliances and stuff. So yeah, it's not. I am worried about this China stuff. I think it's really gonna be there's just gonna be a lot going on in that part of the world that people should pay attention to. It's been a lot going on, but and I think a Biden administration, I think they're gonna be better at forming these alliances because Pompeo wasn't that good at it. Um, but I think he kind of laid the groundwork for this stuff to happen. Another thing I'm actually going to write up tonight. The U.S. Navy is adding another numbered fleet. They have however many numbered fleets. For one example is the Seventh Fleet. It's based in Japan. So when you see these ships go into the South China Sea, they're usually part of the Seventh Fleet. And now, as more and more of these ships are going to do these maneuvers in the South China Sea or near Taiwan or in that region, the Navy is looking to make a new fleet, and a new fleet would need a new base, maybe. So there could be a big new U.S. military base with a big new Navy fleet somewhere in Southeast Asia. The Secretary of the Navy floated Singapore, but I saw a lot of analysts that focused on that region, they said that probably wouldn't be likely, but I could see maybe. I mean, and this is another thing. The Philippines were ready to kick the U.S. military out earlier this year, and then they decided not to, and they just extended the temporary visiting forces agreement. It's called, and the U.S. and the Philippines they're eyeing like a more long-term, more permanent place. I don't know if a whole Navy fleet being based there is really on the table, but there's other places. So yeah, this is
And
just.
is this what they're thinking about calling it the first fleet, right? I
Yeah, the
think.
first fleet. Yeah, they're gonna resurrect the first fleet because the first fleet did exist before. I'm not sure where it was based, but then they did away with it, and now they want to bring it back.
Right. And this is a crazy level of power projection, right? That the US has again, you mentioned the Seventh Fleet, which I think is out of Okinawa, Japan. It has the Fifth Fleet out of Bahrain. And so adding another fleet now is going to, this isn't just claiming the Pacific Ocean, right? All the way from California to Japan is like US naval territory, but this is like now setting the ring like through the entire like body of water of like the southern hemisphere, right? Like they're essentially claiming it all. Like they have like a major airbase out of Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and so if they
Mhm.
stick a naval base over there too, I assume that's, kind of the US declaring that, not only is it the waters from, California to Japan, but it's actually, the waters from California to Miami that the US is going to control.
Yeah, yeah.
It just seems
Um,
insane. just to think about it, that would be, be the vital U.S. interest when, you have a pandemic, all these small businesses are closing.
mhm.
I was driving home from my buddy's house, and some restaurant had on their sign that the COVID mandates had killed they're going out of business stuff. And
Yeah.
all this is going on, and they're like, yeah, but we need a new major military base and stuff like that. I have one more here story on China that I thought was interesting, and speaking about outrageous spending, and that is the commander of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, says that the U.S. needs more high tech weaponry to compete with China. So not only do we need 355 ship navy with a new fleet in the Indo-Pacific, but also high tech other weapons. So
Yeah. Yeah, this is chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, spoke at some think tank thing, and he was talking about like advanced weaponry, hypersonic weapon, basically saying like we need to, really step it up and invest in all of these advanced futuristic weapon capabilities because China, they're going to exceed us if we don't, and they want to dominate the world, blah blah blah. And another thing that he said he's in favor of is increasing the Navy to 500 ships, which is a plan I think devised by Mark Esper, again, Trump's former Secretary of Defense and a former Raytheon lobbyist. So the current plan. So the there's an estimated like I think it's 297 ships in the U.S. Navy, and that's battle ready. If you add ones that are either, I don't know if it's maintenance or if they're in the reserve fleet, it gets up closer to in the mid 300s. But there's the Pentagon released they have an annual report on military's China power, and the latest one, they said that China has the largest navy in the world because they have 350. I think they have 350 ships. So we need 350 ships. And Mark Esper said, you know what? We need 500 ships. So he has this plan. He's out, but that plan is not out. And Milley said in this little speech that he is in favor of that. He said, if you want to take this great power competition seriously, which is the name of the game now, we need a 500 ship navy. And, so it might look scary that China has more ships than us. But if you look at the navies in terms of tonnage, in terms of the amount of water that they're displacing, the U.S. military, like more than doubles China because we have all these aircraft carriers and stuff. So, and then there's an argument, well, that's the problem because China has these missiles aircraft carriers are easy targets for their great missiles. And well, why did they design the missiles? Because there's these aircraft carriers near their shores. So it's kind of this sick cycle. They're going to release a report and say China, they're racing to get AI weapons or robot or whatever, and then we're going to have to get. It's kind of like the Soviet Union, the missile gap, and stuff like that. And you see with this language, with the NATO thing, with just about all these officials, they say we have to work with like-minded democracies, people that share our values. China's trying to, they're a Marxist government, and it's turning into all this real Cold War rhetoric. It's scary. A lot of people we've kind of been trained not to like China over the past 10 years. There's definitely a shift, and nobody really is noticing this. Like the average American doesn't really notice. If they hear about it, they would probably think, oh, well, yeah, China's crazy. They're trying to take over Southeast Asia. So I think it's something that they're going to be able to do pretty without a struggle. There's not really any voices against these big moves. A lot of the good right-wing people, like a lot of good Republicans in Congress, are bad on China. Matt Gaetz said recently, we got to get out of these endless wars. We got to get out of Afghanistan because we got to go face China. China's been growing this whole time. They're our biggest threat. It's like, and that's kind of what all this Trump MAGA stuff ultimately has been about. I think so. It's just, yeah, this is how things are going to be going now.
Right. And it's one of those crazy things, right, where you would think with all the left wing, condemning Trump for Trump and Trumpers for being xenophobic and racist and everything like that, and then they say these things about China, and the Biden people and the Democrats don't go, oh, well, that's racist. They go, oh my God, you're too soft on China. Look at the terrible things they're doing. And I guess it's very odd how at times, like if somebody in the a Trumper or somebody were to stereotype a Mexican, that person would be completely racist, right? A terrible person. And yet John Brennan could go on MSNBC and say something along the lines of Russians are genetically prone to lie or to try to overthrow American democracy, and everybody just nods and goes, oh yeah. And that's not such a worse and more offensive thing to say. And so yeah, I think that's the road we're going down there. I want to talk to you about this thing going on in Somalia, definitely before we wrap here, because I saw some controversy on Twitter between some representatives. I think Rand Paul had tweeted out something like Trump was bringing the majority of American soldiers out of Africa or something like that, which didn't seem right. But anyway, so what are the actual details of what Donald Trump is doing? Are these troops coming home? The headline just says President Trump orders a withdrawal of majority of U.S. troops from Somalia. I've heard they're maybe just all going to Kenya, which, I mean, is I guess less of a war zone, but not really. So,
yeah. So according to the Pentagon, the majority of the troops are leaving Somalia, and an unspecific number are moving to neighboring countries, Djibouti and Kenya. And some are going home, they said, but I think there might have been more statements since I last looked at this. But from what I understand, most of them are going to Kenya and Djibouti, which is where the drones are based that carry out drone strikes in Somalia. And, these U.S. troops, these approximately 700 U.S. troops that are there, they're not doing the fighting and dying. A CIA officer apparently died there recently in a covert raid. But that's the kind of things that are going on there. The U.S. troops, the 700 troops in Somalia, they train the local army. Maybe some of them join them on these raids, small number of CIA paramilitary officers, and we don't know how many of them are there. But the problem with Rand Paul, I mean, yeah, he said oh, thank you, Donald Trump, for bringing our troops home from Africa. He said from Africa too. He didn't say thanks for taking them out of Somalia. So I guess he either didn't read the plan, or if he's just, I don't know, if he's just playing along or whatever. But
Talking to it
um,
on the level that Donald Trump could understand it. He's, it's
yeah,
Somalia and Africa, it's the same thing.
yeah. And so, but here's the thing about Donald Trump and Somalia. Everybody says he didn't start any new wars, which technically, I guess that's true, because when he came into office in 2017, you see articles from April that says Trump is sending dozens of troops to Somalia, which doesn't sound like a big number. And this has been pretty much the most underreported U.S. war, I think, in these past four years. I think it's pretty
I don't know. We
safe to
could
say.
argue about that. We should just spend a whole show arguing
Yeah,
about that sometime. But go ahead. I know what you mean.
yeah,
In specifically, it seems to me like one of the real things lacking in Somalia that you didn't have like in Afghanistan, Syria, or Iraq, especially, is reporters on the ground. And
mm,
so a lot of times, like during the Trump administration, they wouldn't report airstrikes unless people said like, oh, we have evidence that an airstrike, hit this village on this
yeah,
day. And then the Pentagon would say, oh yeah, that happened. And so I think like Air Wars and stuff started asking like in month like batches and stuff like that. So how many airstrikes are between this day and this day? But who knows if they, so I feel like this is like one of those wars where I'm very skeptical that we know
yeah.
even maybe up to half of what's happened during the late Obama years and the Trump years. Because I've been going back and I was just looking at some of my old news roundups from like 2016. And while Obama didn't escalate like Trump obviously went ahead and did, he was ramping up at the end of his administration with like counterterrorism missions and stuff
Mm.
like that. Like it was like creeping up before Trump took office. But go ahead and add more here.
Yeah, so Trump sent the majority of the troops there. Now he's taking the majority out, but the numbers are pretty staggering. I mean, like you said, it's tough to know exactly how many, but going by what AFRICOM admits now, um, Trump bombed Somalia more than it's pretty serious numbers here. 2019, they conducted 63 airstrikes in Somalia. AFRICOM said, and now there could also be strikes being carried out there's a good chance by the CIA, by JSOC, stuff like that. But this is just admitted, and that 63, that's the most in a single year for the U.S. And then to put it into, I always use this number to put it in perspective. It's Nick Tercy. I think he's like the only guy that's really been following this stuff properly. He follows all the Africa. He's good to read. He's at The Intercept. He writes for other places too.
I think
But
it's Amanda or Amber Sperber is another person who's written a lot on
mhm.
Somalia during the Trump administration, specifically Somalia. Terse does a lot of like all Africa stuff, but that's
Yeah,
another name to keep an eye on for Somalia
yeah.
news.
But yeah, the first 7 months of 2020, there was more airstrikes in Somalia than during the entire administrations of Bush and Obama combined, just in that first 7 months of this year, which is just crazy to think about. And now it looks like they're going to be able to keep this going because those 700 troops in Somalia aren't the ones, I don't think, operating the drones. From what I've read, the Pentagon plans that like the New York Times and stuff I've read was that the drones are based in Djibouti and Kenya. Al-Shabaab is a group that we're fighting in Somalia because if we weren't there, they would be, in your house or something. But they're in Kenya too a little bit. And there was actually, and these are the things like the little things that I forget about. Earlier in September, there was a report. Now, this was New York Times, and it was actually from Charlie Savage, the Russia bounty guy. But it said that it cited anonymous officials, but it was a believable story. It said that they were seeking the authority to carry out drone strikes in Kenya against Al-Shabaab.
I remember that one. Because there was an attack by Al-Shabaab on a U.S. or a base in
Yeah,
Kenya that held U.S.
Ken.
soldiers, and so yeah, I mean, from U.S. casualties in the Trump administration, hell, it may be more dangerous for these guys to operate in Kenya than in
It's
Somalia,
true.
because if we're still carrying out airstrikes, Al-Shabaab's going to be just as incentivized to attack, the U.S. soldiers in the region, and it seems like they're able to at least stretch the reach into Kenya. Now, I don't know that I think the U.S. base in Djibouti is like fairly large, and I don't think
Yeah,
they're going to be able to like do anything with that, but depending on where the U.S. troops are in Kenya, like I'm pretty sure they just like straight up walked like onto the runway. Like I
yeah,
don't think they like even like had to like blow up a guard station or anything. Like they were just able to like walk onto the runway and shoot some rocket launchers or something on like a small U.S. aircraft. So
right.
it's I guess good that that they're not in Somalia, because that seems to be like the worst possible thing, right?
Yeah.
But being in Kenya isn't really better. It's just
Mhm.
maybe a little bit less bad. So
Yeah,
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 this doesn't seem like much of an improvement. Now, maybe we don't know, and like 300 of these guys are coming home, and that's good. But
yeah,
I'm guessing the number's more like 20.
yeah, yeah. And another thing Trump did, he loosened the rules of engagement in Somalia, um,
He
which,
declared it an area of active hostility, I think was like
yeah,
the political term
he,
they used. And
yeah, and he expanded it in Somalia, and he did that in Afghanistan and Yemen too, I believe. And Yemen's another one. We all talk about the Saudis' war against the Houthis, but man, there was a ton of U.S. drone strikes and raids there in 2017 when Trump first came into office, going on when Obama was like kind of the momentum was built up, and Trump really hit it hard there. That's another place he bombed. It looks like he bombed Yemen, bombed or carried out like a raid, more military operations than Bush and Obama combined in Yemen in the 2017 and 2018. And while this was all going on, he was supporting the Saudis fighting the Houthis and the UAE, who also supported us. So it's just this big, it's just a mess. And
right,
one thing I think, like, I kind of have been given hammering Trump a lot lately because I just feel like he's getting off too easy. It's like, oh, yeah, Biden is probably going to be much worse in the Middle East than Trump was. But it's even tough to say because what
right.
Trump did with Yemen, I can't say that if Biden ends that war, if he signs this legislation and he doesn't try to take out Assad, I think it's this limited engagement stuff, these drone strikes in Somalia. People don't notice. The U.S. troops aren't dying. We might keep a force in Afghanistan. I mean, how can you just carry that? I don't think they can carry that on. Like just 2,000
Oh
troops.
yes, they can.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's either they're gonna send more in. I mean, it's either they're gonna send. They're probably just gonna send more in because I'm thinking like I can't unless the Afghan government and Taliban come to a ceasefire with the U.S. still there, which I don't think will happen. Then it's just like we're just going to be bombing
Yeah, I don't
without
see
like
any
just
way like
airstrike after airstrike. Yeah,
the brilliant thinkers like Michelle Flournoy, like as Secretary of State, she's not gonna lose that war. Like she'll
yeah,
like think and keep U.S. troops there, and that's another one. And so I think this is the reason that Trump gets off a little bit on his foreign policy record, is because I think his instinct was to bring troops home. And when he brought
mhm,
that up to people, he knew nothing about Afghanistan or Somalia or Yemen. And they said, well, sir, there's threats in these countries. And he said, do whatever you can to take care of them. And so
yeah.
he
Just
ramped up the
bomb.
wars there
Yeah,
with the, stupid, brutish understanding that that was somehow going to allow the U.S. troops to come home sooner. And it just ended up killing a lot more people. I mean, the same thing happened in Afghanistan. They were bombing drug labs all over they escalate the bombing campaign in Afghanistan and Syria. I mean, I don't know if it was from the heights of the U.S. surge during the first years of the Obama administration, but certainly, we only surged a couple thousand troops during the Trump administration, but they
yeah,
definitely increased the number of airstrikes and spread out the targets. I think at one point they were even like bombing Uyghurs in
Yeah.
Pakistan up there.
Yeah, it got all the way out there. If you look at the map, there's like this little strip of Afghanistan that touches China, Xinjiang, and we bombed them there. But yeah, it was 2018 broke the record. So they started keeping track of airstrikes of bombs falling on Afghanistan in 2006, I think. And then 2018 was the highest recorded year, and 2019 broke that record. So higher than the surges, more bombs, and for nothing. It didn't get. I mean, if you look at where we are today, it didn't do anything for the negotiations. It didn't do anything. Should have followed his instincts and just pulled out.
Oh well, that's why you actually like have to read Fool's Errand or something and know that it's all been tried. Do you have a minute to? I know you want to talk about Iran. Do you got a minute to do that before we wrap up here?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. I don't know exactly what you had to add. I had one of your articles here from last week. I had actually, I think, talked about it on the show, and that is, Biden saying that he's still committed to returning to the nuclear deal, but with this assassination, I mean, do you think that's possible? Do you think? I don't see it. So.
Um, I mean, it's really tough to say. I mean, one big thing with Biden is that he says he's going to return, and then he says, and then I'll work on, what he calls follow-on negotiations for their ballistic missiles program and what they call their malign activities in the Middle East. Support for groups like Hezbollah and stuff like that, because the U.S. doesn't support proxies in the Middle East. But so now the question is Biden going to say? Is that going to be like a caveat? Are they going to have to agree to work out a second deal before the sanctions are lifted? Because I think if any additional demands before sanctions relief is just going to be a total non-starter. I mean, how can Iran, their missile program, that's their only means of real defense and deterrence in the region. It's probably the only thing that's protected them from the Trump administration and Israel, like kind of taking that step. So yeah, I mean, tensions are really high. And I mean, this is one of those things like when I follow and I write about, I've been just all day, every day I read about what's going on over there. And I just find it so hard to believe that that Israel, that this could actually happen, that a war with Iran could actually happen, because it would be so devastating. But then you look at what Israel's doing. I mean, there was that report that said Trump considered bombing Natanz, the nuclear enrichment site. And it's one of those things. It's like, no way he would do that. He would think to do that. And then there's these other reports that said he put the policy in the hands of Pompeo and Elliot Abrams, and said he was in favor of covert Israel things. And it's like, and then this assassination, this Fakhrizadeh guy gets killed by obviously Israel. They haven't officially admitted it. And it's just, what is next? Is something next? And is Iran? Can they just keep taking all this crap lying down? I mean, there was a sabotage at the Natanz explosion over the summer, the Soleimani assassination, all these sanctions. Their economy is just in horrible shape.
Well, I mean, I will say it seems to me like Iran isn't necessarily just taking it. They have like taken steps to move the Natanz facility further underground and install more advanced centrifuges.
Yeah.
And now they're saying they're going to enrich their uranium up to, I think, 20%, which is what they were doing pre-deal. This isn't to make nuclear weapons. This is like medical grade. However, I think that if they keep pushing Iran in this direction, then I mean, like there's only so far to a nuclear bomb, right? And when when Trump first took office, I was wondering like if the JCPOA would end up being like North Korea's agreed framework, which ends up being the deal that leads to them getting the nuclear weapons. It was the U.S. really proving that, like, hey, we're not going to live up to our end of the deal, and we're going to push you, to end up, in war. And I guess lucky for I guess Kim Jong-il at the time, they got way too bogged down in Iraq to do anything about them making nukes, and so. I don't know. I don't see that going as well for the Iranians because of the Israel factor. But it does seem like Iran will get to the point where they've either taken so many steps to advance their civilian nuclear energy program that Israel and the U.S. become so uncomfortable with it that they just fear monger to the point that they're able to carry out like a first strike, or uh, Iran just goes ahead and makes a nuke.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that they have any intention to make a nuclear weapon.
Well, I don't either, but like, as you point out, they can't let this go on forever either.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, because if you look at, I mean, the things that they want to do with the nuclear program, it's like, okay, so they're they're under such heavy sanctions. They're cut off to the world economy and the global banking system. So what they want to do now is to make it so they're more independent of this international system. So I think they're more going to, that's kind of the direction they're going to take, and enrich more uranium, get their civilian nuclear program going, because that can really benefit them um, in other areas besides making a weapon. And it's going to make them much closer to China and Russia. And especially if we keep trying to isolate China, which it would be hard to do, sanction all these firms and stuff, which is going to create this natural kind of there could be an alternate banking system in China, Russia, and Iran and Venezuela, um, and maybe years down the line, if the U.S. Because I mean, how can they, after signing that deal, 3 years later, the U.S. pulls out and puts sanctions back on? I mean, if I was like, you wouldn't want to take that. You wouldn't want to trust them again. So even if they do re-enter the deal, I think they're just going to go closer. Just try to get less reliant on the U.S. and the global banking system, and that's like the real threat to the U.S. government. Because if we don't control the world, then what's our money worth? And then so yeah, so maybe that's, I don't know. I'm kind of rambling, but I just think
Eh,
it's but right now, for what people should be just watching for, it's a really tense moment, and Netanyahu might be on his way out too. And something that would be good for him would be a war. Would be great for Netanyahu, because it looks like there's going to be a fourth election. Benny Gantz, the defense minister, they have this power sharing deal. He's going to come in and later in 2021 sometime he's supposed to take over as prime minister. So that's another thing. Netanyahu's back is up against the wall. He might see this as his moment. He's got Trump still in his corner. He could do something a little more provocative than killing a scientist, and see what happens, or just stage a false flag, fire some rockets at some Americans in Iraq. They're going to blame it on Iran no matter who did it.
right.
So
Right. Or even just, get lucky and wait for ISIS to do that or something like that. It's not like there's still
yeah.
like, jihadist Sunnis that are pissed off about everything going on in Iraq the past 30 years that, somebody won't take a shot in America at some point if they don't stay there forever. So, just exploit it. It's not necessarily even a false flag or anything like that. You just take advantage of the natural chaos created by the U.S. But we'll wrap up and I'll let you get back to work. News.antiwar.com, right? That's where everything goes.
Yeah, that's the place.
Almost every day of the week, there's a fresh one for you, multiple up there. There'll be stuff up there tomorrow from you. I know Scott reprints a couple a week over at the Libertarian Institute as well, which is where you find the show. DeCamp Dave, at DeCamp Dave on Twitter, right? Your last name first, then Dave. Anywhere else people could follow you or anything they do support your work?
That's it. We're trying to raise some money at antiwar.com. So if you guys like what we're doing, pitch in and help. Every day we update the page just about. It's a lot of news. It's a lot of stuff people aren't paying attention to.
Yeah.
And you should read
it. All right. Well, thanks for coming back on the show, and I'll have you back on again soon.
All right, Kyle. Thanks a lot.